people. He was the lead counsel for same-sex couples in the landmark California marriage equality case. To round out our panel, we are joined by Mr. Emet Marwell, Policy and Programs Manager at Athlete Ally. Emet is a lifelong athlete, intersectional feminist, and passionate advocate for LGBTQ inclusion. He promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion at the collegiate department, campus, and national levels as a member of the NCAA Division III LGBTQ Working Group. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Janet Judge.
Thank you, Dr. Graham, and thank you to Joe and Elizabeth and the Spectrum Group who make this whole conference look so effortless, but we know behind the scenes that's simply not the case. And thank you so much for making an impact in an area that is so important and vital to the safety and well-being of our students, our student athletes, as well as we're going to talk about today, and those who sometimes feel that they may be marginalized in the space. I can't be more proud to be a part of this panel with some of the most incredible leaders in this space who bring diverse perspectives in their work in this area. We're going to hear from Emet. Emet just talking about what it's like to be as a student athlete, hear a little bit about Emet's story. We're going to hear from one of the leading voices in the space, from Shannon Minter, to give us a little bit of an update on the legal landscape and some very up-to-date guidance on what's happening with the Biden administration. And no better voice than Amy Wilson to give you a sense of what the NCAA is doing in the inclusion space. And this is a woman who is walking the walk, a leader at all times in this space, and a trusted friend of mine. We're then going to talk about, Emet was very instrumental in some trans athlete activism, and we'll hear that story. And then we're going to do a little bit about talking points, some of those things that we've heard from people in the space that they'd like a little bit more discussion about how to engage in meaningful discussions around this topic. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let the people who really know what they're doing drive this discussion. So I'm going to turn it right over to Emet. Emet, tell us a little bit about your story, please.
All right. Thank you, Janet, and thank you everyone for joining me and letting me be a part of this conference. I'm really excited. To start off, I just want to mention that I am coming to you from the traditional unceded land of the Pocumtuck people, also known as Holyoke, Massachusetts. And I want to point out also, very important guest in this picture, who's behind me right now, is my dog Foxtrot, my best friend. So about me though, I'm a trans athlete. I'm a field hockey player. Growing up, I've always been an athlete. I first started playing soccer when I was 3 years old, and athletics has just been such a huge central part of my life and a huge part of my identity. So when I realized, or started to realize, in around high school junior year, that I might be trans, it was honestly terrifying. Part of that was because junior year, as you may know, it's height recruiting time. So I was looking to play field hockey in college. I was questioning my own identity and did some research and realized that if I transitioned and started hormone therapy, which I knew if I transitioned I would want to do, then by NCAA policy, I wouldn't be allowed to compete anymore. So that was probably one of the toughest decisions I ever had to make. And so at that point, when I was 16 years old, I decided that I couldn't be trans, which here I am. I'm still trans. I was trans then and I'm still trans now. But I tried to push that aside because I really wanted to play sports. I wanted to get that collegiate field hockey career. But that really came at a price. It destroyed my mental health. I struggled with suicidality. I had severe anxiety and depression. It was a really tough time for me. So I ended up taking a semester off between high school and college, which meant that I missed what would have been my first field hockey season. My coach was really supportive. of me taking that time to work on my mental health. And then I started at Mount Holyoke College, which is a small, historically women's college in Massachusetts. Started there in spring. And after that first semester, I realized that I just couldn't put myself to the side. You know, I had to be true to myself, which meant transitioning. So after that first semester, I came out, and I was so fortunate that I had incredible support from my family and my coaches and my teammates and the Mount Holyoke athletics department as a whole. I'm really fortunate in that, because that's not the case for a lot of trans kids. So I'm very grateful for that. And I was lucky enough also that, you know, they kept me on as team manager. So I stayed involved in athletics, and I realized that, you know, I think if I hadn't transitioned, well, a number of things, if I hadn't transitioned. One, I probably wouldn't be here today. That's the honest truth. That's what transitioning did for me. That saved my life. And two, I think I would have been less involved in athletics if I hadn't transitioned, because I was so desperate to stay connected to this community, my field hockey family, that I did everything I could. Since I couldn't be on the field with them, I stayed on as team manager. I got a job working events in the athletics department. I, you know, did extra work with our SAC, our Student Athlete Advisory Committee. I just wanted to be involved. I didn't want to lose that community. So I think I was way more involved with athletics than I would have been otherwise, and became very passionate about trans inclusion and LGBTQ inclusion in general in athletics. And that's just been, it's just been a roller coaster since then, honestly. Staying involved after college, I'm currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Exercise and Sports Studies at Smith College, which is another historically women's college in Massachusetts. I'm now policy and programs manager at Athlete Ally, and I get to do this every day, which is amazing. So really my identity and my journey, both, you know, the struggle that I had with my own mental health, and then followed by that incredible support, that's what encouraged me to really take on this work and make sure that other trans folks have that opportunity and have that positive experience that I was very lucky to have. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah, we can go into more depth later, I think, when we talk over the rest of the stuff. But
thanks so much, Emet. And I can tell you, working with Emet, just an incredibly passionate, thoughtful, and charismatic leader in this space. I am fortunate enough to be Facebook friends with Emet, and I am always taken by how many people are interacting with Emet on an ongoing basis. We're fortunate right now to turn to talk a little bit about the legal landscape, which I think is important to hear from Shannon. I can tell you from my own personal experience that there is no greater champion in this space than Shannon Minter. And also I can tell you that every day that I wake up, that I know that I have a call on my agenda that involves Shannon is a good day. Shannon is just a wonderful, positive voice in what can sometimes be challenging work. So I have learned every day, not only legally from Shannon, but about how to be my best person and how to live my best life. So Shannon, I'm going to turn that over to you, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about what's going on more broadly in this space.
Oh my gosh, you're bringing a lump to my throat, Janet. These are three of my favorite people, Janet and Amy and Emet. I am just completely honored to be part of this, and thank you so much to Spectrum for sponsoring this. And I should say, I'm a transgender man, and I'm coming to you all from East Texas, which is the traditional home of the Caddo people. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about just kind of what's going on in this arena legally. There's a lot. All of a sudden, this is not a new issue, but all of a sudden it's in the courts, it's in the legislatures, it's in the papers. And there's a lot of mostly good things going on, but there are some negative developments as well. I think I'm just going to guess like probably everyone almost listening to this knows the basic terminology. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. You know, gender identity is your identification as male or female. And, you know, transgender girl or woman is somebody who is identified as male at birth, but it is female, has a female gender identity, vice versa for a transgender boy or man. And then people who don't identify as either male or female increasingly use the term non-binary. But let's talk about the term biological sex. I just wanted to flag this for you all because it's a very problematic term and it plays a big role in the legal landscape. I wanted to flag that it is a term that has unfortunately been sort of weaponized against transgender people, including transgender athletes. It's a term I wouldn't advise anyone to use in a legal or policy context. There's no like agreed upon definition of the term, whether you're talking legally or medically. And people who are mobilizing it legislatively and in the courts are doing it to really negate transgender people's identity, to kind of erase transgender people, for example, by very offensively referring to a transgender woman as quote unquote biologically male. And just to quickly describe why the term is not accurate, it's because gender identity itself has a biological basis. A lot of transgender people then will undergo medical treatment that changes other aspects of their biological makeup. There's plenty of cisgender people. All of us, everyone to some extent, has atypical biological traits. And again, there's just no agreed upon definition. So it's a term best avoided. Go to the next slide. There we go. Oh yeah, this is just to let you know the courts are starting to catch on to this. So this is just quick, an example from a federal district court in Washington that sort of chided the other side for using the term biological sex in an overly simplistic way, in a way that was kind of antagonistic to the existence and interests of transgender people. And the court is just saying, hey, you know, we're on to this, and we recognize that gender identity itself has a biological basis. So stop trying to use the term to justify discrimination against transgender people. You can just scoot on to the next slide. So at the state level, there's both good and bad things going on. On the positive side, we're up to like 17 states in DC now that have enacted laws that expressly protect transgender athletes. They protect transgender people in education, including in the athletic arena. And then the next slide is sort of the other side of the current state legislative picture, which is very concerning. I'm sure it has not, that no one's missed over the past 2 years that we've just seen kind of from nowhere, this blitz of state bills trying to ban transgender girls and young women from playing any school-based sports. These bills are really cruel. They're based on complete misinformation and bias and negative stereotypes and fears about transgender people. Sadly, however, they have passed now in 9 states. So we can go on to the next slide. So that's the bad news, that we have these 9 state bans. The good news is that they directly conflict with 2 federal laws. One is the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, and the other is Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education in public schools. We can go to the next slide. We recently have a wonderful US Supreme Court decision that held that discrimination because a person is transgender is sex discrimination and is prohibited under federal sex discrimination laws. Even though that was decided in the context of an employment law, it fully applies in the context of Title IX, education as well. And you'll see in a moment that the Biden administration percent behind that. So we can just scoot to the next slide. There's starting to be a good bit of litigation in this arena. So here's an example of a very bad lawsuit that was brought by, in a transphobic way. Unfortunately, it was supported by the prior administration, by the Trump administration, but this is a lawsuit that was brought by 3 cisgender girls that were challenging a very positive Connecticut state policy that lets transgender athletes play based on their gender identity, which is definitely the best practice. And these three cisgender girls were claiming that two transgender girls who were competing in Connecticut were doing so unfairly and in violation of Title IX, the federal sex discrimination law. So it's kind of a backwards lawsuit. Title IX is supposed to protect transgender people, but they were saying that somehow letting transgender girls participate violated the law. This case has been dismissed as moot because the two transgender girls have now graduated from the high school, but the judge did indicate in the decision that if the court had reached the actual merits of the Title IX claim, it would have recognized Title IX protects transgender students. It doesn't justify discrimination against them. And then we could scoot to the next slide. So those 9 states have passed these terrible laws that purport to ban trans girls and young women from playing on any school teams. And there's already, one of them has already been struck down or enjoined by a federal district court in Idaho. I'll just share with you all, it was a very conservative judge. It was a judge appointed by President Trump, but nonetheless, he was able to see that this law that banning all trans girls and young women from school sports is blatantly unconstitutional and discriminatory, and that there was no basis for the law. So that was extremely encouraging. And there is now, we can scoot to the next slide, there is already a new lawsuit challenging the West Virginia ban, and there'll be lawsuit. There's actually a whole slew of new lawsuits challenging some of the other bans as well, but the West Virginia one is the one that's farthest along. And what's really wonderful about the West Virginia case, and it's just been filed, is that already the U.S. Department of Justice has weighed in this case and let the court know, and it's in something called a statement of interest, that they strongly oppose this state ban, and that they absolutely think that the state ban violates Title IX. You can see some of the great language from the brief filed by the Department of Justice here on the slide. Like, any state law that denies a class of people the ability to participate in a federal funded education program because their gender identity doesn't match their sex assigned at birth violates Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause. The other great thing about this is they are very clear that there's a transgender girl that's the plaintiff, that it doesn't work to say, oh, well, she can't play on the girls' team, but that's fine. She can just play on the boys' team. The Department of Justice here is like, no way, like that, it is untenable. That's the word they use, say that a girl, a transgender girl, should just play on the boys' team. They recognize that that is tantamount to completely excluding her from school sports. So very strong language in this brief from DOJ. And then next slide, which is our last slide, the Biden administration has already, right off the bat, taken very strong, made very strong statements, not just in that lawsuit where the Department of Justice has already weighed in, but the Department of Education has been extremely active. They have put out a Dear Educator letter, a statement of public notice, a new fact sheet and a Q&A. So this is their Dear Educator letter where they're saying, hey, all you school staff at every federally funded school in the entire country, we're writing you a letter to make sure that you absolutely understand that the recent Supreme Court decision that said transgender discrimination and sex discrimination applies to every publicly funded school in this country, and that you better not be discriminating against transgender kids, including in sports. And if you do, we're going to come after you. I'm sorry, there's actually one more slide. And then they put out this wonderful fact sheet that is like a Q&A and answers various questions that people may have. And I was so thrilled and happy to see that one of the examples, one of the hypothetical questions that they put into the fact sheet involves discrimination against a transgender student in the sports arena. The little example they give is that a student joins her friends to try out for the girls' cheerleading team, a transgender student, and the coach turns her away from tryouts solely because she is transgender. When the student complains, the principal tells her, well, those are the district's policies. They are literally in this fact sheet saying, if something like this happens at your school, you reach out to the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, and we will immediately jump on that and let the school know that that kind of discrimination is unlawful. So I'll end there, but suffice it to say that we have a current administration who could not be more supportive of transgender student athletes.
Thanks for that, Shannon. A couple of just quick follow-ups. As Shannon knows, that we had some cases that during the prior administration, and it was the first administration that we saw where there would be a Title IX complaint filed where the government would use the term biological sex in the filing of the complaint. It was just a real complete sea change of how Title IX complaints came out. Just to be crystal clear, the Title IX applies to public and private institutions that receive federal funding in any way, shape, or form, and that can be even assistance provided to students in the form of grants or loans that then pays for their education. So that's a very broad application of coverage. Now, some people say, well, then, is the NCAA covered by Title IX as well? And especially important right now, given that everything that you've just heard from Shannon, not just the NCAA, but regional conferences, high school conferences, and others. And there's some case law in the books case law has been on the books for quite a long time. And we just saw in another case, a Supreme Court case having to do with antitrust and college athletes, that prior opinions that have been on the books for a very long time are fair game for this Supreme Court. And so the question of whether or not indirect recipients of federal funding may end up have coverage under Title IX. At least we have case law out there that says they were not 20 to 30 years ago. But of course, that case law may be subject to some challenge. So we'll see where that comes forward again. Thank you so much, Shannon, for giving us that update. And also, I know Shannon's involved in some of these challenges that just talking about the challenges being brought, but the reality is that Shannon is integrally involved in bringing some of those challenges. Shannon, could you just answer one question? The Department of Justice filing, who signed that, and how significant is it with regard to who actually signed that particular document?
It was signed by Kristen Clark and Pamela Carlin, the top two people in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. So believe me, when people at that level of seniority sign a brief, it sends a very powerful message that transgender student athletes have support from the very highest levels of the U.S. Department of Justice.
And then I'm going to throw out one more difficult question. But what would you say to those individuals who are in states that have state laws that are conflicting with the very guidance that you're telling us is coming out at the federal level, especially those public institutions at state in those states that feel a considerable amount of pressure from their state to comply with the state law?
Yeah, there's just no question about this legally. The Constitution includes something called the Supremacy Clause. It says when there is a conflict between a federal law and a contrary state law, the federal law trumps. The federal law is controlling. So any school administrator at any level who lives in a state that has one of these discriminatory state laws, they should not be following the state law. They better be following federal law, which prohibits discrimination. And there's no question about it that if they don't and they wrongly follow the state law, they will be sued. They will be sued in federal court, and they're going to lose because the law on this is really, really quite clear.
Yeah, so a difficult position for those people in those states who are trying to figure out how to walk this path, and it's good to have these materials that are helpful for people to have some discussions on their own campuses to be able to sit around the table and talk about where things stand legally as well. I'd like to turn it over now to Amy, who can talk about the NCAA and the intercollegiate landscape.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Spectrum for hosting this really important event. And it is such an honor, Janet, to be with you and both Shannon and Emet. Thank you, Dr. Graham, for the great introduction. So really, again, glad to be here with you today. And in my role at the NCAA, I lead a small office, the Office of Inclusion. We have a team of 6 persons. And if we go to the next slide there, I'll talk a little bit about what we do in terms of core areas. First, I want to note that inclusion is a core value of the NCAA, and that's a direct statement from our membership, our board of governors, who are the presidents and chancellors who run the NCAA. I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. We have 5 areas that we work on. They're not all that we do, but they are disability, international, LGBTQ, race, ethnicity, women, gender equity. And we're always thinking about the intersection of those identities and how we not only serve student athletes, whom are our focus, but also those who teach and lead our student athletes, our coaches, administrators, et cetera. And so our signature event every year is our annual Inclusion Forum. And we just held that event in early June in a virtual space, much like this conference. We're hoping to be in person next year. But much like this event, it's a few days of all things DE&I with our specific focus on our membership. And one initiative that I wanted to talk about from our office that we're particularly proud of, particularly in the very divisive environment that we've all been living in terms of just politically, socially over the last handful of years, is our Common Ground initiative. And as I look at my teammates for this presentation, Janet, Emet, and Shannon are all veterans of the Common Ground initiative. Not only are they veterans of it, but they have made just extraordinary contributions in that space. And I've had the great privilege to get to know them better and to spend time with them through this initiative. But essentially what we've been doing since 2014 is across our membership, we've been inviting LGBTQ individuals, individuals of faith, those who share both those identities from all of our schools, public and private, and also representatives from LGBTQ organizations, faith-based organizations, to come together to learn, to discuss, to talk about commonalities and differences, with the whole point of focusing on our student athletes and how we create environments that respect the dignity and well-being of all students. And so it's the one thing we can agree on, even if we have different philosophies or views of the world or different tenets of how we believe things should move forward. And so it's a place we struggle in, but we are committed to continuing that dialogue, so bringing people together. And if you're wondering more about what does that look like, if you Google Common Ground at NCAA, we have detailed meeting reports from those experiences that you can read through, but we do things like talk about terminology, we share lived experiences, we discuss and break down different sorts of triggers and words and phrases. We do exercises where we join each other on common ground to identify ways that we had no idea that we had similarities when we feel like we come from such different spaces, all with the goal of developing action plans to take back to campus to create more inclusive environments for all of our students. And so we're committed to the space even with COVID, and we're right now working on a virtual version of Common Ground that we want to hold in 2022 with the goal of being back in person soon as the world hopefully becomes a safer place. So I wanted to share that initiative, and thank you, Emet. Thanks for having my back there. He just put the website in the chat if you'd like to know more about that. So what I want to do today is to share a little bit about the in-state policy. I have been at the NCAA for close to 6 years, and the policy's been in effect since 2011. So it was created prior to my time at the NCAA. It's my job and the job of our office to support our member schools and conferences as they work to implement the policy, which is very much about providing a pathway to opportunity for transgender and non-binary student athletes. And so, as I noted in 2011, but what's lost on a lot of folks, I certainly get a lot of calls and emails. Amy, please change this. Amy, please do this, please do that. And within our system, I facilitate all that I can to move forward in inclusive ways. I want to be clear, we are membership driven. And so I mentioned earlier our NCAA Board of Governors. That is a group of presidents and chancellors from across all of our schools in the membership, heavy representation from Division I, which are our larger schools, that make decisions about our association-wide policies like the transgender student athlete participation policy, and also make big decisions about how the NCAA operates and moves forward. So I wanted to point that out, and I'll come back to that at the end of my remarks when I point out a non-discrimination policy that the Board of Governors has and why that's essential to what we might see happen in the next few weeks in our space. I also want to note that the NCAA has back one more time. I got one more quick thing to say there. We also have 4 diversity, equity, and inclusion committees that are made up of presidents and chancellors and athletics administrators and coaches, faculty athletic reps, senior woman administrators, student athletes, most importantly, student athletes' voices there. So persons that hold all sorts of roles in our athletics department and our schools. These 4 committees, and we're good at giving really long names to committees at the NCAA, so I won't read all of them to you, all right? But they're all important in driving forward the work of the NCAA. So in big topic issues we're working on right now, whether it be a gender equity review of NCAA championships, I know many of you are aware of coming out of the women's basketball championships in March, or other issues, very important matters like our transgender student athlete participation policy. These committees are engaging there across the membership. So if we talk about the NCAA policy, I was a longtime college professor, so I know it's too much language on a slide and you never want to read it, people. But what I'll say is that our policy has a basis in testosterone. So when we're talking about a transgender male student athlete, testosterone is a banned substance in the NCAA. So for any student who has a prescription from a doctor to take testosterone, for a variety of reasons, they must apply for a medical exception. And that's important so that if they test for that, that exception covers them. They're under a doctor's guidance, and so it protects them moving forward. And so the way the policy works is that for a transgender male student athlete who would like to take testosterone, you apply for that exception. It goes through one of our membership committees that is in our medical health and science area. And then that student, may participate on the men's team and is protected if test positive for that particular substance. However, that student is no longer able to participate on a women's team. And so, Emet, as I talk about this, I'm certainly thinking of you. And while this policy provides some pathway to opportunity, it does not serve everyone. And I just want to note how much I always appreciate your vulnerability and your transparency in the way you share your story. So thank you for that. I wanted to acknowledge that. And when we turn to look at a transgender female student athlete, again, we're looking at testosterone. In this case, it requires suppression. For 1 calendar year, the NCAA doesn't document that. We're not looking for a certain level, but we do ask that the school keep on record that student's treatment with their doctor, and that suppression has occurred over a year. Once that's on file, then the female transgender student athlete is able to to play on that particular team. If a school were to decide not to follow the policy, then we move away from teams being able to be in the category of a women's team, and it becomes a mixed team, and that has ramifications for championship play and things of that nature. So this policy is currently under review. I'll talk more about that in just a second, but I think that's an important point. It was 10 years ago that it was created. It was done with the science and medicine of the time, and in the context of all sorts of environment, political, social, all of that. And so it's under review, and it's time for it to be reviewed to see if we are in the best place to serve all of our student athletes. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to note, I really appreciated, Shannon's comments about biological sex. I also think there are so many persons who rush to that there's one way for everybody to enter the space. Everyone's journey is unique in terms of transition, whether it's social transition, deciding to take hormones, to suppress hormones, surgery. Everyone has their own journey and their own way forward. And so we want to make sure that even though the policy 10 years ago didn't have the foresight to identify non-binary, genderqueer, we absolutely need to update the language of the policy, and also to note the full range of student athletes that this policy serves. I've seen some research lately that nearly 10% of young people are identifying as non-binary. They're not identifying as male or female. And so we need to realize the world we're living in and how do we better serve our student athletes. So we do note that a student assigned female at birth who is not taking hormones may compete on either a men's or a women's team. A student assigned male at birth who is not taking hormones may compete on a men's team, but may not compete on a women's team. That is the current status of the policy. I mentioned that the policy is currently under review. The membership committees that I talked to you about, not the Board of Governors, but the 4 who are looking at DE&I and also medical health and safety, met last summer, about 1 year ago, and were asked to make a recommendation to the Board of Governors about changing our policy, perhaps. Those 4 committees all came together and said, we don't feel like we have data, from all of the lenses from which we should be studying this policy to suggest a change, but we think the NCAA should sponsor a summit, and we did so in October of 2020. We held that summit, had about 60 people there. Most of them were persons connected to our member schools. We had thought leaders in medicine and science. We had thought leaders in mental and physical health, and also in inclusion, and came together and really tried to look at the policy through the lens of competitive fairness and equity, through the lens of inclusion, mental, physical health, and safety. And the outcomes of that summit, there were 2 really powerful ones. And I want to thank Emet, because I think he's really responsible for one of those, was that we absolutely have to prioritize the voice of our student athletes, all of them, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, however they identify. And Emet, your voice was a powerful part of that summit, and thank you for that. There were persons who participated in that summit who had never heard the lived experience of a person who identifies as transgender or non-binary, and what it's like not only to navigate just life in general, but to navigate the athletic space. And that was really important to this overall discussion. This is a matter of persons' overall well-being and their safety, and it's incredibly important that we keep that at the focus. So as we are moving forward from this summit, we have a couple of action items that are occurring. First of all the participants in the summit came together on action items they would like to see. Many of those are related to education. Many of those are related to just mental health resources. And so there are a group of consensus statements about things that the NCAA membership and the NCAA national office should do moving forward. And that will be coming out a little bit later this fall. In addition, we are working on a narrative review of literature across the board in science and medicine, inclusion, physical mental health. I've mentioned those categories multiple times now, with experts and scholars who are reading the literature that currently exists to help us in the review of the policy to find the best way forward, and also to identify gaps in the literature, gaps in the research. We know that they're there. And we're also committed to continuing with educational resources. My inbox is full every day with emails from coaches and administrators, from student athletes who need support and help and guidance. So again, so the summits are ongoing, and we're committed to those. And as a final comment, last slide, I believe for me, if we go to the next one, or excuse me, 2 more slides. I'm following your line, Shannon. I'm one early. The NCAA Board of Governors is the group that releases statements about the NCAA's position on this particular issue. And today is July 1. It's a big day because, as Shannon showed us on that map, most of those state laws that have gone into effect in the past handful of months, or have been passed, go into effect today. A few are going to I think match up with the start of the academic year, but generally speaking, this is a day for that. So I'm very much thinking about all of those impacted by these actions and negative ways. So we did state in April, meaning the Board of Governors, that we firmly and unequivocally support the opportunity for transgender student athletes to compete in college sports. And so what does that mean when there are states who are essentially shutting down any opportunity for that participation? I do know that the Board of Governors is working on a statement right now. If it had been released or ready or in my hands by the time we started today, I would have had Janet and our great support people at Spectrum for this presentation updated. So I think there will be more to say on this. And so that will be coming. I just don't have it quite today. But one of the things this statement mentions is on the next slide now. And the NCAA Board of Governors did pass an anti-discrimination policy in 2016. This is important. It came in the context of when North Carolina was passing laws that limited transgender and non-binary persons' access to restrooms and facilities based on their gender identity. When that occurred, the NCAA removed championships from North Carolina in light of those actions, and this policy was developed. And essentially what it says is that any entity that hosts an NCAA event, championships, but also other events where I hold the inclusion forum at a particular site. We must be able to say that that environment is safe, healthy, and free of discrimination, and that it safeguards the dignity of everyone involved in the event. So essentially, when an entity bids to host one of our events, they have to answer a series of questions, and they have to note any state laws, any local policies, any city ordinances that could prevent them from having an environment that does what the statement says here. So, when the Board of Governors next meets in August, they meet in early August, as they consider the anti-trans bills that are now in effect, this policy will be something that they're utilizing to consider how the NCAA moves forward in that space. So I want to give time for all other voices and all sorts of questions, but I'll stop there. That is an overview of the landscape of where we currently are with the NCAA policy and what I see as actions moving forward. So thank you, Janet, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, and we've had some very thoughtful discussion going on in the chat box, and Emet has been monitoring the chat box. Thanks, Emet. Emet, do you want to address because there seems to be a theme to those questions. Do you want to address the questions that you've been answering?
Sure. Most of these are really about the hormones and restrictions or requirements on that. So Shannon just popped in the chat as well. Another response. So a trans man who is not taking testosterone can play on a men's team or a women's team. A trans woman who is not taking hormone therapy for at least a calendar year cannot play on a women's team. And as someone pointed out, this doesn't take into account or doesn't address all different situations where a trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming person might not want to take hormones. If that's not the right choice for them, then in some cases they're sort of stuck in a bind here and do have to, choose one, men's or women's team, or are forced to be on a team that does not line up with their identity. And then there was one other thing that well, now I lost my train of thought and I can't find that comment that I was looking at. So, but Janet, if there was anything else that you saw that you wanted me to raise, or Amy or Shannon, any one of you.
No, I think there was some confusion over the NCAA policy. I think you articulated it quite well. Amy, did you have anything to add to that, or are you set?
Yeah, I don't now, Janet. I'm kind of scrolling through the chat. So if I can be of help later, I'll start to take. I wasn't looking while I was talking, but I'll be glad to do that. So thank you.
Okay, and so we're going to move on we're going to have Emet back up. So Emet, welcome back into the space. Emet took the lead in organizing a group of trans athletes, and he's going to talk to you about it. But I just have to say this was something that Emet, instigated on his own. He was thoughtful about this and had a tremendous impact. So I can't wait to hear. Emet, would you share your story about your activism with the NCAA?
Yes, absolutely. And real quick, I see the chat's blowing up here, so I do want to note so towards the end of this, we will go through some talking points about hormones, about surgery, about talking about trans athletes in general. And so I think a lot of these comments and questions are things that we'll address at a later point. So hang on to those. But there's some great questions being asked, and I really appreciate that. So this whole situation with the political landscape and the legislation across the country, the anti-trans athlete legislation, that's it's just overwhelming right now. At this point, there's been over 70 anti-trans athlete bills in over, I think it's 30 something states across the country. Some of them have passed, some of them have been signed into law. And so that raised issues for me personally. And, I've known Amy for, I don't know how many years now, but she's been an amazing support personally. And the Office of Inclusion, I've done a lot of work with them, and I really appreciate all that they've done. And I know that they're doing their best at the Office of Inclusion to really, support trans athletes. And what was frustrating for me is knowing that about them, that there are good people who are really trying to do their best within the NCAA. And then for the NCAA President Mark Emmert and the Board of Governors to, in April, they put out a statement saying they firmly and unequivocally support trans athletes and their right to compete. And then this spring confirmed that they are hosting some championship events in states that had passed these trans athlete bans. So for me, that didn't line up. And it's definitely been frustrating that it feels to me like there are some people who are listening and there are others who are not. It feels like, I don't know, the Board of Governors and they want to do what's right, but their actions don't align, in my mind, with how they should. And I also noticed that there was a lack of the trans athlete voice in this larger discussion. There have been, as Shannon mentioned, there's the friend of the courts brief that a number of very prominent sports icons signed onto, alongside several athletic organizations doing advocacy. So Women's Sports Foundation, Athlete Ally, Lambda Legal, and there have been a number of other voices in this conversation, but there has not yet, until this letter that I wrote, there wasn't anything that was specifically and solely us as trans athletes, as trans and non-binary athletes, sharing our voice collectively. There have been a number of folks speaking out individually, but it's really powerful in my eyes that we join together as trans and non-binary athletes and show, because there are a number of us, that letter that I signed and sent to the NCAA, sharing my disappointment, my frustration, and the reasons behind that. We had 50 student athletes, NCAA student athletes who are trans and non-binary or gender non-conforming. Some were current, some were former, but there was 50 of us who signed on, and that's not counting all the folks who didn't see it, who didn't feel comfortable signing on, who, whatever the situation might be, right? And it also doesn't take into account that there are fewer collegiate trans athletes than there are high school, just because that's the way sports works, right? There are a lot more high school athletes than there are NCAA athletes, because not everyone continues. And I think for trans athletes, that's especially true, because it's so, it can be so overwhelming just to transition and to jump through those hoops, those requirements, and being out anywhere, but especially going into a new environment in college or transitioning while you're in college. I know a number of folks who left athletics because they couldn't deal mentally, emotionally with transitioning and trying to play. And there's kind of a time limit too, by the way, when you're in collegiate athletics. You only get so much time before you have to leave. So there's a number of different reasons why I think there aren't as many trans athletes in the NCAA as there might be. But there's still, 50 athletes who signed on to that letter, in my mind, is quite a lot. I made the mistake of reading some Twitter comments after that letter got posted. Don't ever read the comments. I think we all should know that by now, but I did. And someone was giving me flack for having only 50 student athletes sign on. And in my mind, I was thinking, can you please introduce me to at least one trans athlete you personally know before you make that comment? Because there's really, it's a small fraction of athletes. And actually there was, the USA Today just posted an article, I think it was yesterday, with some information. I have it pulled up. Let me just link that in the chat, about including some stats on trans athletes And they found at the high school level, they did a survey of high school athletic associations. And this past academic year, they only counted 30 trans athletes. And that was counting on the higher side, because there's some imprecise numbers. So that's sort of the larger number that you could come up with. It was 30 high school trans athletes in the entire country. So that's what I'll say for now. But
so thank you for those thoughts. And the fact, I mean, I was one of many people who were taken by the activism that you showed, the bravery of the students. That not only for some students signing on, it was the first time that they had signed their names to something and were outing themselves, right? So they were putting themselves in a position of being in a very public space that has some extremely high and some hateful discussions around it. So your leadership was fabulous. I saw, the nice comments that I was able to see were on Facebook comments, where your community and our community were together talking about how meaningful that was. Also, to hear from others in the space, in the NCAA space, talk about it in a separate way about how meaningful and important that letter was and the impact it made on its intended audience. We'll see where things go. As Amy said to you and said to all of us, the NCAA policy was written a very long time ago. It's being revisited. It was part of the summit. There's a considerable amount of discussion going on, and just another reminder that the NCAA's passage of these sorts of policies are based on the membership's participation in these discussions. And so we are all watching closely and have great interest to see where those discussions may go. But let's move on and talk about some of the things that are important, some of the talking points that we have out there. Unfortunately, oh, there we go. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to advance the slide. So whoever has that ability right now, it'd be great if you would advance the slide, please. Okay, until somebody's able to put that together. Okay, here are some of the talking points that we have that address some of the issues that are being raised in the chat room, and I am thrilled to have the level of engagement that we have among those who are participating with us. So, Emet, why don't you lead us off in some of these points, and we'll have others jump in.
Sure thing. And to echo what Amy mentioned earlier, I know this is a lot of text for one slide, but I wanted to get as much up there as I could to give people those tools to have these conversations. So, number one, athletes come in all shapes and sizes, cis and trans alike. There's just natural variability. Regardless of gender identity, regardless of sex, there's always variability in bodies, and that's still true in sports, and different bodies excel in different sports, and people just choose what sport is best for them, what they enjoy, and what they excel in typically. So it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that I often talk about. I'm sitting here in front of you all. I'm almost 6 feet tall, and I played goalkeeper in college at Division I level, and I would like to say a lot of it had to do with my just unbelievable athletic skills. But let's be clear: being 6 foot tall in the mouth of the goal is an inherent advantage. And there were many other female student athletes who did not have the same starting place as I did, just due to those physical characteristics. So that's a great point, and one that I talk about all the time. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So next up, all of this legislation is a solution in search of a problem. We don't have any evidence that trans athletes did, or will ever dominate in sports. The stories that you hear about are typically cherry picked. For example, when Shannon talked about Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller earlier, and those 3 cis athletes who brought the lawsuit against them, those athletes who are cis also beat those 2 trans athletes more than once on their own, and that, you know, there's just, if a trans athlete wins, you know, one race or a couple races, that's all you hear about. You don't hear about all the times they've lost. But if you look at the stats, that's the case. There's no evidence that anyone has been dominating. Sport governing bodies have had policies in place, trans-inclusive policies in place for decades. There haven't been issues. Like we mentioned, the NCAA has had one for the last 10 years. Other governing bodies, like different high school athletic associations, have had ones for longer than that. The IOC has one in place that's, I don't remember exactly how long that's been, but similar to the NCAA, I believe, maybe a little bit longer. There hasn't been an issue. It's very, very recently, within the last few years, truly within the last presidential cycle, that this has really become a politicized topic. All right. When we talk about scholarships, a lot of folks say that trans women will take away scholarships from quote unquote real women. And that's not true. We're unaware of any trans athlete who has received an athletic scholarship of any kind. And not all schools and divisions give scholarships. There's a number of different ways that scholarships for athletics works. And some of them are not even based on the athletic performance at all. You know, it's team fit, it's academics, it's are you eligible, right? So there's a number of different things that go into that scholarship point.
Emet, at this point in time, we're actually at the end of our time. We have one additional slide that will be part of the materials. In fact, if you advance the slide, then people will have those as their materials. We certainly started this fabulous discussion, and we'll look and be interested in ways to continue this discussion. And I would love to take this opportunity to thank my fabulous co-presenters. You know, Amy, just thank you for being here. Shannon and Emet, exceedingly wonderful discussion, clearly brought up important topics. Thank you again to Dr. Graham, and how lucky our SUNY POSEM students going to be as they have a new president come on board. And just a profound thanks to Joe Storch and his entire group for all of the amazing work they're doing within the SUNY system, and especially with regard to this program. Joe, I can't thank you enough for allowing me to be part of this program with you, and I just have enormous respect for you. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you.
I'm not often speechless, but when I hear that from somebody like Janet Judge, I become speechless. I want to thank John Graham for joining us and convening this session. I want to thank Janet and Emet, excuse me, and Amy and Shannon. What an incredible topic, a moving goalpost, as it were, to use the sports analogy, because when we started talking about this topic, there were fewer bills, different bills. We had not yet had the statement of interest from the federal government. We had certainly not yet had the June 23rd DCL. And just, we are going to watch this space, and I hope that if we are live next year for Spectrum 2022, that you will all join us wherever we are. This is going to be something we're going to be talking about for a while. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us and for this incredible panel. We have one more day of Spectrum content. It's hard to believe this is already day 4, and what an incredible conference it's been, and how much we've loved the chat and the exchange. Please join us. We are starting tomorrow at noon Eastern, and you will all have the link in the email in the morning. We have, I believe, 4 sessions tomorrow afternoon, including some really incredible ones. So thank you very much again to our panelists, and thank you to all of you. We will see you tomorrow.